Yeah, and my critique is not that the South was as bad as that, but the acts of terror that people were allowed to engage in with impunity are no less gruesome and are no less provocative than the acts. I mean, it was if you hang a person out and you mutilate them and you set them on fire and then you shoot them and then you insist that they hang from the tree for a week and you make black people look at them as a statement to that community, you've done something horrific. And it has the parallels that we talk about in the modern context. And you're right. What happens in response to that is that millions of black people flee to Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, not as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, but as refugees and exiles from terror. We have to stop telling the lies that we tell about who we are. You go to the American South and the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. We celebrate our history of slavery. We celebrate our era of terrorism. We've got to actually create a bigger kind of space to be truthful about this history.
Well, talk about race and the death penalty, because when you look at death row, there are, blacks are not the majority there. There are actually more whites than blacks. But you have to look past that to find how race really plays into death penalty.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Sure, it's the race of the victim. So that the death penalty is the blue ribbon we give to people who murder the folks we care most about. And because there is this hierarchy of whose lives matter, 80% of the people on death row are there for victims who are white. And even though people of color are much more likely to be the victims of homicide, they don't become the death penalty cases. And so it is still incredibly racially skewed, and you find that evidence not just in the percentage of defendants of color, which is disproportionately high, but you find it most dramatically with race of the victim. The court case that the United States Supreme Court took on that was really designed to end racial bias in the death and to end the death penalty because of the evidence of race was all about race of the victim. The Baldus study in 1987 established that in Georgia, you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black. 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the defendant is black and the victim is white. And these data could not be contradicted. And the United States Supreme Court didn't quibble with the data. They didn't say, we don't believe you. They simply held that the death penalty is constitutional because of two reasons. One, if we deal with racial bias in the administration of the death penalty, it's going to be just a matter of time before we start having to hear complaints about racial bias in other forms of the criminal justice system. And Justice Brennan, in his dissent, ridiculed the court for its, quote, fear of too much justice. And he was right. The second thing was the thing that I think ought to haunt us, all of us. As the court said, that a certain quantum of bias, a certain amount of discrimination in the administration of the American death penalty, a certain level of racial bias, is inevitable. And because it's inevitable, we can't do anything about it. This is the court that has equal justice under law engraved on its front. It is the court that produced Brown versus Board of Education.
You've argued in front of the Supreme Court a number of times.
Yes.
To your knowledge, any of the justices who are making the decisions about the death penalty and its constitutionality, have they ever actually witnessed an execution?
Oh, certainly have not. I mean, the only justice who had any kind of personal relationship to the death penalty was Thurgood Marshall, who stood with condemned people, who represented condemned people, and of course he was passionately oppositional to the death penalty. I think part of the challenge that we have in this country is that we've created great distance between the people we put in jails and prisons and the rest of us. We build these prisons out in the middle of nowhere. We don't make them accessible. We make it really hard for people to get inside. You've gotten inside a couple times. You talk about transparency. There's absolutely no